Okay, Ivan, am I ready to just get going?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Do let me know how the sound is. Turn my microphone up or something.
Sorry, can you repeat
Okay,
that?
just bear with me. I have to hide the screen. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I really do wish that I could be there in person, but thanks to the team for their patience and dedication, setting so we can do this digitally. So on the screen is a statement. The built environment is a manifestation of the society that created it. I don't think that is particularly controversial, although some people may disagree on some points. But really this statement, I really believe in, is at the heart of investigation and the work we do. And it's kind of the foundation for what I'm going to talk about. And really what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is not really proving this, but it's starting to question it. It's kind of like, it's almost been through my career, this thing that I just held to be true. And more recently, I've started to say, okay, so what? If that's true, if the built environment is a manifestation of the society that created it, what does that say about the built environment? Why, what can we start to think about it that maybe we haven't thought about it before? The project I'm going to talk about has a sort of a working title or a loose title of EXTANT, and through the talk that's going to become more obvious what it means. But right up front, just wanted to kind of give the definition that EXTANT means, well, it's a thing that used to exist and still exists. So extinct is something that used to exist and no longer exists, and extant is something that used to exist and still exists. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And I've called this presentation a pre-alpha presentation. As you'll see, I'm very early in the process. I'm much more used to being asked to do talks at the end of a project, or even sometimes 10 years after a project, to kind of revisit it and present all the findings. And this is a little different. As you'll see, I'm at a much earlier stage at this point. So that in itself became really interesting. So everything that I'm doing at the moment is an investigation. It's do something and listen to the thing that you're doing, get a sort of haptic feedback, and learn from that sort of active questioning. And putting this talk together has been a really big part of that. Actually, I started off quite nervous about it. Like, how do you talk about something that you've only just started? But that in itself really gave me a lot more understanding about what I'm doing. So what's on the screen at the moment, I think most people will recognize. It's a diagram for the most common kind of story structure. It's not the only story structure, but it's certainly the most dominant in the early 21st century, which is the 3-act structure. So we have the introduction, we have the action, and the conclusion. Most of your academic papers will have had this structure. It's very easy to understand, and it has this the angle of the triangle is the rising action, or the growing interest towards the conclusion before it peaks. If it doesn't peak right at the end, there's a bit of time for it to conclude and come back together. And so that's typically how I put my talks together, presentations, things like that, lectures, when I'm teaching. And that's what I did 3 years ago. So the last time I had a talk in Bulgaria, I was lucky enough to be there. That talk was on the topic of rebellion and how designers are rebellious de facto, how they can develop that and kind of start to be more aware of the decisions and the changes that they're making. So the simple structure for that was I looked at the history of kind of rebellious acts in architecture and architecture education. I looked at a whole range of rebellions, whether they were social, political, design-led, that were contemporary, what had been happening in the last few years. And then to conclude, drew that back to the world of building design and looked at how the field of building design, designing the built environment was changing, and what sort of opportunities there were there for people to make changes that they wanted to see. So then I thought about, so I'd kind of taken that as a staple and something I've done for years. My project of EXTANT. And I started to think about how this as a project would essentially go over time. There'd be the early stages, the main action, and then the conclusion where you sort of tie the things together and kind of reflect. And the reality is I'm here. This is where I am at the moment. I'm very early stages where I'm still figuring things out. And before I get into the sort of the main actions, I feel that could, if I took the typical structure, it's going to be very underwhelming. It's going to be a very short talk, and I'm going to leave you with a bunch of stuff and promises about what is going to happen in the future. So that's not very interesting for you guys to listen to. So today's talk, I am going to take that 3-act structure. I'm going to have this introduction that we're listening to now, get into the main action, and then there will be some sort of conclusion, hopefully satisfactory. Do let me know if there's a problem with the sound. Just getting some messages about my microphone, but I'm just going to keep going unless I'm told otherwise. So today's talk is going to take that 3-act structure, and then that really resonated with this whole project, because what I started to think about then was, okay, we have this story, this paradigm, this structure, which has this flow where you're given certain bits of information to progress the story, to build towards that rising tension, towards that conclusion. And that's based over the period of the story, usually time period. But now what I'm doing is I'm condensing that down into that small part at the start. So I'm going to have that flow, I'm going to have that build towards a crescendo and then the conclusion at the end of it. And that's going to be very much at odds of how I talk about it way into the future. So you kind of start to have this kind of very simple to see kind of clash between where we decide, that decision that we make about where to start the story and where to end it. And we can project this quite simply over the 3 acts. And the urban designer in me is put in mind of positive and negative space. So things like the Molly plan. We can see that by changing this story from being 1 story into 3 stories, we now have new peaks, We now have drops in information where there was key events in the longer story. So just by choosing the start and end is going to edit and affect the quality, the fidelity of the information that we're getting all the way through. And that's not because stories are a bad thing, losing that information. We build those stories, as I said, to make them engaging, make them interesting, make them understandable, make all the information kind of slot neatly into place for the person who's listening. But there's a risk within that of the data that we lose and the things that we put onto the cutting room floor. So there's the question, what effect does this have on our built environment? We obviously think in stories, communicate in stories, and stories require editing, they require flow. So what is that editing and flow of information kind of, how does that affect how we think about our built environment? So moving into, so I have these questions and now I have to think about, okay, again, that golden question, so what? What are you going to do about that? The first thing to do is to look to see where do narrative clashes occur. And I've gone back to the original statement, the built environment is a manifestation of the society that created it. Now this infers that the built environment has some sort of social story, okay, that there is a given story which is held by a group, and you know, obviously raises the question of individual versus versus social. So what about social stories? Ian Stewart and Jack Cohen had this same question, really. They were very interested in how stories and storytelling affects education, particularly in the field of science, because they're two scientists, and through their careers they started to see how humans, how people, how their colleagues, how themselves would share information through these story structures and how that sort of affected the type of information that was given. And they coined this phrase extelligence. Okay, so extelligence really is what it sounds like. So I think we're all really aware of what intelligence is. So how smart, how clever an individual is, how an individual's mental attributes. So this idea of extelligence is the group intelligence of a society. And to kind of picture this, you can think of things like journals. So scientific journals and peer-reviewed journals, and we have those in the art and design world as well, where people will work on their own projects and for rigorous review before publication. And so once that little bit of information is out there, that starts to affect how other people think. And so as a group, as a cohort, there is this development of skills and understanding and that kind of thing. So this idea of social stories certainly has a foundation in philosophy and also in the science world as well. And if we do kind of start to interrogate our built environment, obviously it's quite easy to, more easy to look at somewhere with a lot of people, like a city. And the example that I have been drawing on a lot at this stage is the city of Barcelona. And it's a city I know fairly well. I visited probably half a dozen times. My thesis project was in the city, so I know a little bit, or I knew before this a little bit about its narrative history. And it's a very well documented city, being such geographical importance. There's a lot written about it, and particularly about its history. And the slide I'm showing here is from an official website of the history of Barcelona. It's really interesting because it's linking that history to plans. Again, you know, the urbanist in me, first thing I think about with analysis of built environment is a plan map, which is really interesting and something we're going to look at. So the official story, as documented through various histories that I've read and through this website, is that the city started to come into existence somewhere in the region of 1000 AD. And obviously it's persisted until today, so 2021. So just over 1,000 years, we have this story. But what about the personal experience? Nobody has experienced the whole of Barcelona over those 1,000 years. I would argue that nobody's experienced the whole of Barcelona over the last 12 months because we are only individuals. So looking at when I start to think about personal experience when it comes to urbanism and the built environment, my cornerstone, my touchstone is always Kevin Lynch, Image of the City. It's a book I read in my first year, and it really, well, it sparked a lot more questions than it gave me answers, honestly. But I really like that. So I think probably everybody knows this book, but within it, he interviewed inhabitants of cities and asked them for directions through their city. And he listened to the way they described their journeys and broke them down very analytically into 5 elements: paths, edges, districts, landmarks, and nodes. And from that, he was able to create these mental maps of cities, of showing how people cognitively thought of the shape and fabric of their cities and how they navigated, or through navigation he did that. Now, this was really interesting because it does get into sort of that experiential and that personal, but it still tying it back to like a big map, bringing those individual experiences together and consolidating them into a social story, essentially. Then another big influence for me was the Situationists. Again, their work wasn't completely satisfactory for me, gave me a lot more questions than answers, but their interest really stemmed from the fact of a personal, on their side, a personal dislike of the changes that were happening to Paris, particularly the motor car and sort of like how they saw their old Paris disappearing. It was much more individualistic. It was, they even called it, you know, the Situationist. So it was all about these moments, about situations they found themselves in. And their arguably most well-known work was the Dérivé, which was wandering. So walking through the streets with no preconceived aim or goal of where you're going to, just following the senses and how each situation, each moment influenced you. And they attempted to create these maps, but these are much more personal and individual and difficult to read as well. Now, the last thing on this element that I want to touch on is if we go back to this timeline, and this idea that Barcelona has persisted for over 1,000 years, it's way bigger than a lifetime. And to kind of put that into perspective, if we put sort of a healthy, reasonable lifespan of 78.5 years, if we put those end to end, that's 13 generations of people. Okay, so from, with no overlap, just head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, in a line. That's 13 generations that covers that. So if we were to take the each one of those lifetimes as a story, we can start, and contrast and compare that to the social story of the city. We can start to see the disjuncture that starts to exist there. The human life narrative of their story and their experiences in the city, peaking and troughing, with much shorter periods of actual relative change within the city of Barcelona. And that's if we take the entire lifetime, because just think about the week that you've had here and all the experiences you've had, and how each day has created new stories for you, and how the trip overall has created new stories for you. So we're really getting into this idea of fractal story experience versus these long social stories. So that's some well-documented things and where my thinking is at. And then the next thing to talk about is kind of the key inspiration for what I'm talking about today. And this is work by Dicle Koshkar, seen here organizing a talk for Occupy Getty movement. So the last project she was working on was a project in the Iranian city of Yazd, theoretical project. And at the analysis stage, she was really focused on this idea that there was a real disjuncture in the city of Yazd between what could be described as traditional vernacular building. So lots of houses, inward facing, round courtyards, very tight network of streets and fabric and that kind of approach. And then much more recent modernist development, and how these two elements were fragmented, and her interest lay along that rupture. And as we talked about it, as we turned over this kind of observation and analysis, we were kind of focusing on this idea of eras of development. So obviously the traditional had been happening for a long time, and there was a change in regime, one which embraced all the facets of modernity, including urban design, including architecture design. And this came with it a planning decree and a movement within the planning of the city to very abruptly move towards all things modern. And the word that Dicle kept coming back to was this idea of eras. As we talked, we felt that there's a level of sort of zooming out, having to put aside our own biases as a designer, and kind of that impulse. I said that the last talk I did was about rebellion, so about wanting to change and wanting to be rebellious, and realize you have to zoom out a little bit to look at the larger context of this social story. Are you operating as a designer in a very fixed moment. So the centuries of very gradual change with that traditional approach, or is it a flexible time where there is this moment where, okay, we're moving towards modernism. What does that mean? And a lot of decisions are going to be made. A lot of impact is going to be had, which is going to be felt for generations. And that moment of flexibility or flexible design is really rapidly going to be closed because those decisions will be made. And then you'll be in another fixed period where this is what we do. We do modernism now. So it became really kind of this real spark to challenge how we perceive, and then a question of, okay, how do I think about this? How do I analyze this? How do I talk about this? So the question really became, can we study cities as a social object? So the focus really will be, or my focus has been in this question on Barcelona. A couple of other cities as well, and we'll touch on that a little bit at the end. So the first thing was to look at Barcelona, all this great wealth of information that exists about its development, plan drawings, all this kind of thing, and to start to analyze it from an intelligence point of view, looking at the story. What is the story? And as I said, fantastically, there's, I mean, I've got a number of books, but there's also this fantastic online resource which overlays plan view maps, and you can actually see different snapshots in history of the city. And here's some. This is not actually all of them because some go back to predate 1000 AD. But these are the ones that they've chosen. It's really, you know, if we think back to those early slides, it's quite interesting when they've decided to create these snapshots. What was the reasoning behind picking 1700, 1750, 1840, 1859? I suspect that's because when a map was drawn, like a new map, a new measurement of the city, usually those are tied to something as well, especially when you start to delve into old maps, which I have, and they're fascinating. They're usually a reason why somebody would be commissioned to make a map, because cartography, map making in 1840 was not a simpler job as it is today. But looking through the reading on top of just the maps, so the social history, not just the fabric, allowed me to pick out some eras. So I kind of picked out in the sort of the same way we looked at with EASA, which had those two. The 7 sort of key points or key flexible moments that I've kind of picked out were 1000, when it was a Roman town, 1400, which was the development from being Roman to being a medieval town, the 1700 War of Succession, which Barcelona lost and had a huge impact for centuries to come, Renexienka in 1815, we'll come on to that in a second, the 1908 formation of the Society for the Attraction of Foreigners, and the 92 Olympics. And then today, I've put 20XX, by the way, because the information kind of fluctuates between sort of 2010, 2020. But also there's a blurriness in history, which we'll talk about a little bit towards the end as well. So having selected those dates, we can kind of like just show like how many of these maps become relevant. how many of these plans, which have their own information, were really time periods of fixed development, where as we'll see, where things were filling, gaps were being filled in along a predetermined plan almost. And then I did what any urbanist would do who doesn't know what they're going to do next. I started drawing in CAD, lots and lots of drawing in CAD. And these are the results. These are plan drawings put together from historical data. Needed a lot of tidying up. There was a lot of inaccuracy, and making them relate across eras is much more work than you may on the face of it consider. The majority of historical maps were created from scratch, so they wouldn't take the previous map and trace over it and then add the new parts to the map. They would start the whole process again. And so errors and inaccuracies mean that once you digitally overlay them, they don't line up, and it takes hours. So very modest Roman town, very kind of standard formula. In 1000, in 1400, we see the completion of the second outer wall. So that's when it reached its extents of what it was going to be for centuries to come. 1700, with the loss of the Spanish War of Succession, the city was fortified. A large garrison fort was built there, and the city was occupied by Madrid forces. And that lasted for, so that's the moment, that's where the city was developed up to that moment. And this is where it is 150 years later, having had its growth restricted. And you can see that in response, other settlements are starting to develop outside of Barcelona proper. Renaxienca was the moment where permission was given to demolish the fortifications and also the medieval walls as well, which had been throttling the development. And we start to see the development out from there, and the famous grid plan is starting to take shape. And in 1908, there was this creation of the Society for Attraction of Foreigners, because after decades, centuries of stifled growth, to be able to start to actually occupy this space, more people were needed. We see through to the 1992 Olympics, which were seen by the city as an opportunity to further define their development. A lot of infrastructure was realized due to the progression of the Olympics. And then we have today. Yeah, today is just today. And that's kind of interesting because it's not interesting. So we have these moments, and we can start to look at, again, this idea of this fractal story. So we have, okay, the history of Barcelona is 1,000 plus years, but then we take these moments between fixed and flexible. The stories, those very condensed 1-line, 2-line stories that I just gave you for each of those moments of flexibility, those action points. It's interesting that they get more and more close together as we get into modern times. But again, we can kind of see that, if we just looked at the plan just those drawings, without those social narratives, without the understanding of the changes in governance, the change in social policy, we're not going to understand that kind of geometric development of those drawings. So again, the built environment is a manifestation of the society that created it. ... But there is no blank canvas. Okay, that's the big challenge to this, isn't it? We inherit a lot. Can we say that the city, the built environment, you know, the city, the town, the village that we live in is a manifestation of society as it is today? Well, no, because we are, a lot of our geometry, our urban geometry, is defined by decisions that were made a long time ago. But that still persists in that social story as well. So there is that relevance to that social story persists within us as well. So it's this kind of tension between experience and progress. So here's just a little snapshot into the nightmare world that I lived in for quite a number of weeks. You can see that on the right hand side, on the actual drawing itself, in the model view, you can see that those lines don't line up. So I'm in the middle of a task of making those lines line up. It's all just rock and roll. But what I would really like to draw your attention to is down this side here, where we've got all the layers. I'm assuming everybody, if you don't know AutoCAD specifically, you'll all be computer literate enough to know that individual layers. And what I did in the drawing was not just create a layer for 1400. I created a layer in the drawing for everything that was built in 1400 that survived till 1700, but no further. And then everything that was built in 1400 that survived till 1850, but no further. So we have quite a lot of layers down here with all of these different sort of eras, and they're sort of how far these elements lasted from era to era. And because of this, I can produce this drawing. So this kind of disco-colored abomination that you're looking at is the urban fabric of Barcelona as it is today, with the rainbow colors indicating the moment in time that element of fabric was integrated. So you've got red from 1400, yellow from 1700, green from 1850, and so on. Now, I think it's pretty interesting in itself. I don't think it's like tremendously like groundbreaking. I think understanding like the history of things is, you know, we're quite good at that. Again, we're going to get to that sort of that element in a little bit, but it's not quite all there, is it? Because when we're looking at those lines, are those lines the actual fabric? Has that actual building been there since 1400? Or has the line of the wall that is there now, was that there from 1400? We also, a lot of things, we can see that there's nothing from 1000. There's no physical trace of that Roman fort, except a general sort of curve in the road here. So when we look just at the fabric, we do start to lose elements as well. Things kind of fall into that negative space. If we were to do the same thing for 1400, so the second era that we've identified, the map would look like this. It would be super boring. There's just one element here. I don't know if you can even see my mouse, but there's a black line that curves in the center that is the original Roman fortification wall, and that's it. Everything else has been built in the 400 years since then. But we can think about this time period slightly different. We can start to think about the experiences of this time period a little differently, because we know things that they didn't. We know the stories that are going to come after 1400. We know those eras. You know, it's like Romeo and Juliet, where the narrator at the start of the play tells you that the main characters are going to die. We know what fates befall 1400 AD Barcelona. So we can take these persistent elements, and this is kind of what it looks like. This is all the development from 1400 that didn't make it to 1700. This is the development that made it from 1400 to 1700, but no further. Here they are all kind of spread out, and it's kind of weird looking, isn't it? It's kind of weird to look. I know that probably looks terrible on your screen. There's so much information, and the images have been made so small. Hopefully I'll be able, well, at the end of this, I'll be able to share a much larger format drawing, which should be a lot clearer. People want to kind of dig into it a little bit. But it's quite, isn't it really weird to look at a city like that with all those elements from that moment kind of separated out? And this is what they look like all together. So we can now start to look at this drawing and see the projection forward, the persistence of 1400. What was going to stay the same through those years? What experiences, urban experiences, those moments, you know, what pieces could be part of a derivé in 1700 and in 1908? What elements would form those mental maps across different time periods? So here we are. Worth just pausing to say, don't worry, we're through the introduction, we're through the action, we're into the conclusion now. So this is where I just would gently like to remind you that I'm going to be concluding this talk, but I'm really only concluding the introduction. So it's more about why next? What next? So what, Chris? Was it worth the you know, probably possibly 200 hours of AutoCAD drawing to do this? So what are the conclusions that I have? Well, first of all, there's no blank canvas. I think this is really well known. This is anything new. This idea of the city as palimpsest, as a communal piece of writing which is being erased and rebuilt over time. But that said, there are moments of greater or lesser impact. Okay, there is really in urbanism a right time, you know, right place and right time. Those moments where there's going to be some sort of change in the social structure or governance or movement or something like that. It could be technological. And that's kind of really important for anybody who wants to work in a built environment, to be aware of those larger changes, and also to be supportive and vocal. If you have planners or politicians or people who you really want to see you want to be part of their vision, or you think they have a good vision or will change things for the better, then support them. That is just as important as any individual piece of design work that you have. Is there a bias of the present? And there is. It's not a question to me. There's just absolutely a bias of the present. with urban analysis, if given a project to work on in Barcelona, you're probably going to start here. You're probably going to look at the city as it is now. Like, even if we talked about the history of the city of Barcelona, we would end the story in 2021. And why would we do that? Just because it's today. You know, the idea that, you know, the fact that I even picked it out as one of those moments of eras is ridiculous, because there's nothing to say that anything particularly interesting is happening. Historians typically wouldn't touch, wouldn't define what was happening in a particular time period. So at least 50 years have passed for that particular reason. So, you know, again, that might not sound particularly interesting, but if we do think about the ebbs and flows of storytelling, the transmission of information from person to person and through social groups, the idea that it concludes with where we are now is not very helpful. If we look at the persistence of 1400, we can see how interesting that is because we know all of those things that are going to happen. If we look at the persistence of today, well, we don't know anything, do we? It's all just there. It's just existing now. What impact are things likely to have? What is vulnerable? What is going to change? How can we, I think the real question for me, this is a question for me, is it even possible to project thought into the future? You know, are we doomed as humans only to think about the past and the present and then have a vague idea of what these futures will look like, and only kind of continually come back to ideas which are grand scale grid plans and the tabula rasa approach of demolition and construction to what makes sense. So a big part of that for me, being a words person, is vocabulary. We have the word extinct, things that used to exist and no longer exist. We have extant, things that used to exist that still exist. Is there a word for things that exist now that will continue to exist? Beyond exist, beyond persistent, beyond, those are words that can actually just mean now. And I don't care if it's in English, it could be in any language. It would fascinate me to find that there are, well, it always fascinates me to find words that exist in one language which are not translatable, because it indicates an ability to conceive of something that isn't universal. We have moribund, which means dead or dying, so something that's is about to go extinct. We have that, but do we have the flip of things which will continue to exist? A visual language, show, don't tell. I'd say that in case there's a lack of clarity, extant to me is primarily an artistic endeavor. I'm drawing on my background in urbanism, interest in philosophy, but it's very much about this question of, can we even communicate this kind of change in perspective? I will leave it up to smarter people than me to do something with it, to do the, okay, so what, how is this going to affect our design processes? But is there a visual language for that? And as I say, as an urbanist, I will automatically fall back onto planning. So I do have this as a larger drawing, which I can email to the organisers, which will be nowhere near as compressed and pixelated as this. But this grid is my first little venture into how can we start to kind of communicate this idea of changing fabric and changing experiences, how decisions made 1,000 years ago can still play an impact in today, but not in a straightforward linear way, because we've been through so many different moments of decision making, that those original decisions have like no bearing on the context that we're dealing with today. So in this grid, the squares in green are those snapshots of time. So we have Barcelona in year 1000, in 1400, 1700, and so on. From left to right, we have the elements which are persisting. So the elements within the year 1000, which made it to 1400. Nothing made it to 1700, etc. that way. And then this way we have the elements which were then removed. So these, this is the fabric that was demolished between 1000 and 400, and we can isolate out all of these elements, and we can start to see that looking at the city just in a purely 2D way is going to reduce the amount of data, the amount of information, the amount of understanding of experience that we have. Ultimately, I want to explore fractal storytelling. How can one embrace this complexity? How can we create stories which are legible, that people can understand? So not, not just David Lynch kind of films, not just Pulp Fiction films where they're chopped up into different orders. How can we communicate, or even can we communicate this this fractal complexity, these elements, this individualism within these larger wholes? I think we can, and that's really where my interest lies, is the storytelling. Taking this idea that, we can take this 1,000-year history, we could break it down into 13 lifespans. That's still quite arbitrary, because we would still only be on those individuals and with no overlap, and not all the other lived experiences that are happening at the same time, or the various eras of their life that those people were going through. And again, this idea that just to visualize this city where it's quite to say, okay, this is the medieval quarter. Okay, this is the Roman quarter and this is the medieval quarter, the Raval. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because we see so many decisions and changes which are happening in these intervening 600 years, that to kind of oversimplify this as the medieval quarter is it's creating negative space in the storytelling. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I have one final thing to show. Okay, I'm hoping this is all still working. So I have a film. It does have a little bit of voiceover, but the voiceover is by me, so it's kind of terrible. And it has subtitles anyway. So if you can't hear the voiceover, it's literally just saying the same thing as the subtitles. View, pressed F11, nothing happened. Okay, fantastic. I hope that the sound comes through automatically. If not, just let me know. The built environment is a manifestation of society that constructed it. It is built on a fabric of choices made in context of requirements. Conclusions of these overlaid contexts create complexity. Within this complexity, there persist fragments, imbued with our memories. They contain beauty. People exist within them. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. And I guess questions.
Yes, thank you as well for the amazing lecture. You can see in the chat, we sent you a link of a Google Doc where people have writing questions. Can you find it?
Yeah, I am just trying to enter.
Link do EASA.
Okay. Oh, can I see people's names? Okay, so what do I think about cities built from scratch in a new remote place? I probably too many things. I'm a little bit blue screened, a bit stun locked. Thinking about there is no from scratch. There is no from scratch. There will be some raison d'etre, some reason for being, for that city to be located in that location. Infrastructure, whether it's resources, it may be some natural geographical advantage, like a natural harbor or something like that. So there's a reason. And we'll give it a reason as humans. We will have some sort of genesis story, some sort of myth for that place. And then it has inhabitants. It has people who live there. So either it's a very small place and there's some pioneer type people who move there and have a reason, sort of a push factors for leaving were and setting up there, and it grows very slowly from like a village kind of point of view, or it's like a new build city, in which case large amounts of people will move there, will immigrate. Both at the same time. It's really interesting words. And they bring their experiences. Their story doesn't start when the city story starts. So, how those communities grow, the preconceptions that they have when they get there, all of those things are going to be coming with them. So it's a really fascinating question, but I would say that there is no from scratch. There was always something before. How are you going to connect personal stories in your map? It won't be in the map. I think the mapping part, I think this is, there's an old phrase which I try to keep at the forefront of my mind, which is, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's a very practical adage, but it's really useful in reminding us that just because we were taught a certain set of skills for a certain task, it doesn't mean it's the right set of skills for every task. And the mapping was really useful for me because it took so long. And there was a lot of forcing me to sit still and forcing me to look at this very repetitive grid, and turn over the kind of thoughts and kind of the kind of questions that are here. What if a city starts from scratch? These are the kind of places my mind would wander. So the mapping is an analysis tool. I'm not sure I'm going to get there in terms of it being a communicative tool, apart from being able to, because one of the things that I found was working at such a big scale, like Barcelona is massive, and then some of the most sort of impactful, dramatic, traumatic changes were the size of 1 or 2 city blocks. There was this whole period, 15 years ago, between 20 and 15 years ago, when in the Raval district, they were aerating the Raval district, which was basically compulsory purchasing the buildings and knocking them down to create open spaces. And the reason was tourism, because it was seen as the jewel of Barcelona, but tourists were unwilling to go into the area because of the close, tight-knit streets and how unsafe it felt. So they were opening up these public parks and that kind of thing. And that really gets lost at that large scale, especially when then I reduce it down to try and fit it onto one piece of A1. And a lot of this has been quite a meditative response to the limitations of those practices, and how can I augment it? How can I create physical objects which create these stratas, which maybe use projection mapping, which with images overlaid? Is it about creating traditional written stories, which are then infused and kind of supplemented with these maps? The one thing that I think is really useful through it is finding those anachronistic fragments that I talked about in the video. I love that viaduct. Okay, so that's here in Birmingham. So I'm in Birmingham right now. So at one point, railways were the most important thing in the country, and particularly for the city. So just get those viaducts in, get the railways into the city for industry. And so these long viaducts, these railways became these kind of walls, like literal walls, and kind of conceptual walls as well. And the geometry of the city kind of builds off and around them and into those gaps. And then at some point, trains aren't as important anymore. They're just not. We've moved on. So you end up with that viaduct, which is literally kind of its bridges, and has become these little elements that nobody bothered to knock down. So they're completely isolated. The rest of that fabric from that era has gone. It's disappeared. And you have these anachronisms, and they're interesting, and they're still impacting us now. The geometry of those streets is still the same, even though all of those contexts have disappeared. And so the mapping allows to pinpoint those. And what I really want to do is I want to celebrate them. I worry that as we, as individual humans, have access to more and more information, we have this natural human instinct to simplify things. I don't think the world is becoming more antagonistic or there's more clashes. I think actually everything's getting kind of calmer, but it feels like there is for us as an individual, because we've got so much access to so much information. Look at this. Look at me talking to you, wonderful people, all these hundreds, if not thousands of miles apart, instantly. I would like to shine a light on that, if not understand it, just to be able to shine a light on it and to show that complexity is this thing that we thrive on. You know, what complexity is these elements of things where people exist. So it's quite a long answer for what was a really simple, straightforward question. I apologize. What do you think about structures and buildings which still exist but are not hosting people anymore? I always like them. I always want those projects. Those are the projects that I want. I'm always drawn to those buildings. I'm always feel, you know, reuse, refurbishment. I really like them. I am drawn to don't like pickling. I don't like this is and this is completely personal. Okay, this is not like I've got any huge wisdom here. I don't like pickling. I don't like, and for me, pickling is when something gets heritage status and it has to remain the same. And it's, to me, it's absurd. I get the feeling of wanting to protect vulnerable fabric that could be lost or demolished in the name of progress. But it's going to lose its context and it's going to just become this objet d'art, this just curio. You know, just like you know, some rare species of animal that's been put in formaldehyde in a gallery in a museum. It's kind of like you get that feeling. You kind of get that feeling if you go to Venice, if you a bunch of other places as well. But my personal like is when things are slowly developed and built upon and built upon and built upon. So you can see that thought process as it's happening and those different decisions and constantly finding new uses for things. Personally, as well, I'm delighted because the number one most environmentally friendly thing you can do is to reuse a building that you have. Even retrofitting a building is not as environmentally friendly as reusing the one that's there. I'm aware that I'm kind of rambling, taking up all your evenings. So how do we do the connection between research and this and the way it affects design process in the future, urban design wise? With the historian's 50 years way of work in mind. Yeah, that is a really good question. That's the next step. I think one thing I've always been frustrated about in the design world, and I'm stressing in the design world, when I compare it to kind of the science world, is in the design world, there's always this kind of accusation that's thrown. What you're going to do with it? Okay, and I kind of feel that there's like different stages in the process. There's observation, there's research, and then there's sort of the application of that. And maybe I will never work out how to use this to design, and you know, that's a distinct possibility. Maybe it's going to be, you know, maybe I only exist in that observation part. And if I do, fine. I think, you know, my advice to all of you would be, it's not failure to just stick to the things that you're good at. It's absolutely not. So if you are a super strong designer, then look for other people's research, look for other people's observations, and vice versa. So the question, how do we do the connection between research as this and the way it affects our design process in the future, urban design wise? I would say, if you find it interesting, big if you don't find it interesting, then don't. But if you find it interesting, then be aware of it, pretty much. There's no blank page. There's no blank page. Even if you have an empty site, there's no blank page. There's some sort of story that started before the story you've been told. And I think that's the interesting thing. And also that once because design finishes before it's realized as well, which I always find is really, really weird. We'd love a world where the design process continues. So after construction, and it's this mutual reciprocal development. But what you build is going to get demolished as well. And to understand that, to really understand that there is a flow that's happening that your design is part of, it will, I believe, help with the values of the decisions that you're making in terms of what your priorities are going to be. Do you think that the zoning of cities is preserved with that? Okay, sorry, I'm having a dyslexic moment. The zoning of cities is preserved with their development. Okay, I'm going to do a classic lecturer trick, which is I don't understand the question, so I'm going to answer a question that I do understand. Right, is zoning preserved with the development? Cities have to change, and the zoning of cities has to change. And it's a really interesting thought because it's really unpopular thought, because what that means is that it needs families and communities that grow up in an area to develop and move. And the reason is because, unfortunately, we live in a world where economy happens and it doesn't stop. So what that requires is cash flow. Okay, it's not about wealth or wealth accumulation. It's just the simple continual flow of money. So let me put it this way, as a thought experiment. You have an area where it's full of young families. Okay, so what do young families need? They need schools. So you have schools in that, you build schools in that area, and that young family grows up, the kids grow up, they use the schools, brilliant. Then the kids leave, they move out, but the families stay there, and now they're older families who don't need schools. But now you've got an area which has been zoned with schools, with all the amenities for young families, but people, irritatingly, have gotten older. So that happens. It happens in the UK. I knew a practice that was doing research for the RIBA, for the Royal Institute of British Architects, about making flat pack schools so that they could dismantle them and then move them to areas that needed schools. The same happens with like industry and things like that, if we think about most cities with, most big generalization, but most medieval cities and most early industrial cities, those historical, the oldest bits, then eventually become the trendy place to live, whether it's these medieval stone wall buildings and things like that, or whether it's warehouses converted into flats within city centres that used to be horribly inhospitable due to smog and pollution, and now become locations to live, like what I'm doing right now. And then, I live here like an idiot and then complain that there's no supermarkets to go to because the area was developed for warehouses and factories. So, yeah, I think zoning does preserve it, but it's not such necessarily good thing, and flow and flexibility needs to be properly understood. What is the most interesting part or idea that you've found in the process? It's always when I talk to people. So, most interesting part. I was really happy. I was talking about this lecture to a friend, this talk to a friend, and explaining what I was going to talk about. And I was explaining that I was struggling with a concept. And I was talking about fractal stories, and I was so happy with myself. Like, pride always comes before a fall. I was so happy with myself about it because it really just fit with what I was thinking about. But I couldn't explain the gaps in the story. I couldn't put it into words. So I was talking about these gaps because of the fractals. And my friend said, "Oh, so like, the positive and negative space of stories." And I was just thinking, why didn't I think of that phrase? Like, I literally do a lecture every year about Rachel White Reed and positive and negative space. Why didn't that vocabulary come to me? So the most interesting part is that it's the positive and negative stories, which, taking that idea from design, from nollie plans, from sculpture, and trying to flip this whole conversation around. So I started with, how does narrative affect cities? But then to think, okay, how can cities affect narrative? That's definitely the most interesting part for me. I think I've got through all of them, unless I missed any. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, you did.
Super. Are there any? I'm so aware that it's 10:30 for you guys, if my thinking's right, and you probably want to be in the bar at this point. So, is there any other questions, or is it beer o'clock Pivo time?
It's not going to be beer o'clock yet because we have a discussion afterwards, but soon enough it will be. But yes,
Fantastic.
has any questions? I guess not. You've been more than I forgot the word, but you gave us a lot of answers and a lot of questions to think about for sure.
Yeah, probably more questions if I did it right. That was my aim. Look, guys, thank you so much for having me. I apologize that it could only be virtual. I would have loved to have been there, shared the evening and the discussions with you guys. But thank you to the organizers for kind of like how smooth and easy this all was.
Yes. So let's say, but yeah, and hopefully we can see you maybe next year.
Yeah, I would love that. That'd be fantastic.
Yes. Thank you again so much for your time and for everything you shared.
No problem. No problem.
Really been
I will
inspiring.
sign off. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye. Down. But
Okay.